So on July 13th, the recommended specs for Ratchet and Clank Ripped Apart were revealed, and honestly, I'm pleasantly surprised. The system requirements are pretty reasonable for a game like this. I will admit that it still kinda irks me that PC game charts like this use 720p 30 FPS as a benchmark. Like, no one on the PC's playing at 720 30, but whatever. But I mean, 960 for minimum, 3070 is gonna get you 1440p 60 with ray tracing, high graphics, that's assuming this chart is accurate, which we really don't know for sure until we see the game in action, but assuming it is, these are pretty reasonable system requirements. But that's not what was making the rounds on Twitter. You know, the system requirements being reasonable weren't why PS5 SSD was trending all day. You see, in the lead up to this game's release on PS5, we were rather explicitly told by Insomniac that this game was only possible because of the PS5's SSD.
Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is a game that utilizes dimensions and dimensional rifts, and that would not have been possible without the solid-state drive of the PlayStation 5.
That one didn't age quite so well.
This statement was obviously wrong from the start, and it just so happened to correspond with one of the PS5's main marketing buzzwords, so like, most of us were able to see right through this from the beginning. There's obviously nothing fundamental about this game that needs an SSD in order to exist, and the system requirements of the PC version confirm that, because you can see right there in the minimum requirements section that the game can be played with an HDD. Now, how well the game will play on an HDD remains to be seen, but the fact of the matter is that it is not a requirement to play this game with an SSD. The PS5 marketing train lied to you. The game was never bound to SSD equipped hardware, but now that the PS5 faithful are starting to stare in the face of proof that Sony and Insomniac maybe were dishonest about something, you'd think that they would be able to be like, huh, and have a moment of self-reflection and be like, man, that's a little awkward. I sure was bamboozled there, and then they move on. But if that's what had happened, I wouldn't be making this video, would I? Certain dumb people are cherry-picking the RNC RAPC specs. Yes, the game can run on an HDD. No, that doesn't mean the PS5 SSD is false advertising and their games don't need it. Not to mention the HDD is for minimum specs. Meanwhile, they recommend an SSD for the ideal experience. Yeah, of course they recommend an SSD. An SSD is always recommended because it makes the experience better no matter what game you're playing. SSDs are objectively better than HDDs, so of course they're going to be recommended. The fact that the minimum specs confirm you don't need one proves that yes, Sony and Insomniac did lie about this game needing an SSD to exist. Of course, all the other recommended graphic settings say SSD recommended, because an SSD will always be the recommended experience over an HDD, but that's not the point. The point is that the game does not need an SSD, and you were lied to. Also, this is some fucking goalpost moving if I've ever seen it. Like, oh, just because they lied about Ratchet and Clank doesn't mean other PS5 games don't need it. Motherfucker, no one was talking about that. Oh, this isn't false advertising because PS5 games still need the SSD, even though we were deliberately told this one could only exist because of the SSD. Like, huh? 720p 30 FPS, lol. Congratulations, you figured out what a minimum setting is. Also, Last of Us profile picture, opinion discarded.
We got a banger, Kevin!
I saw some people saying the HDD is only going to work with the lowest possible settings, even though that's literally not how spec charts like this work. Like, yes, the bare minimum specs that the devs recommend using for this game will get you 720p 30 FPS, because playing below that is basically unjustifiable in the current year, especially on PC. But the other settings combinations here say recommended. So of course they're going to recommend an SSD over an HDD. And of course if you want to play this game with the max of the max, you should use an SSD. And right now, we just don't know the extent to which an SSD is actually going to make a difference in this game during gameplay. Frankly, I'm starting to think it's not actually going to have that much of an impact, or at least not as much as we initially thought it would, because apparently you only need 8 gigs of RAM to run this thing. And I know RAM and hard drive are obviously two really different things, but the system requirements for this game are honestly a lot lower than I expected they'd be, so that on top of the fact that the SSD isn't a requirement, yeah, I think it's reasonable to start questioning how much the SSD is actually going to make a difference during gameplay. And I'm honestly really excited to see all the hardware test videos when this comes out. This is going to be a really interesting game to test. See how it runs before you run with that. Look at how low spec the game is going to run also. Literally everything is minimum at 720p 30 FPS. Yeah, because it's the minimum requirements. Literally everything is minimum. Yeah, in the minimum requirement section. How did you tweet this if you can't fucking read? Not mandatory, but recommended. Plus, it's only not mandatory for the lowest setting. People playing at that setting better love loading screens, lol. Really? SSDs are mandatory above the lowest settings? Where does it say that? Look at the chart. Point at where it says playing above the lowest settings requires an SSD. Because I don't see that anywhere. You really think that if you boot this game with the minimum settings, the HDD will be allowed, but the second you change one of the settings or turn one of the graphics settings up, you'll get booted out until you switch to an SSD? Like, you really think that's how this fucking works? True PlayStation fan 66? Why in the name of God's holy green earth trees? Why would that be how this works? Like I said earlier, we just don't know right now how much the SSD is actually going to impact the experience, but by the developer's own admission, it is not a requirement to play the game. Now, obviously, we can have the debate over whether or not an HDD is, capable of giving you a good experience on the higher end of this chart, but as I've said before in this video, that's not the point. The point is that the SSD is not required. So yeah, we can infer that there comes a point along this chart where not using an SSD might get problematic. But until we get our hands on the game and test it ourselves, we just don't know where that point will be. But I can absolutely promise you that you will be able to play this game on an HDD above the minimum settings. Because to suggest otherwise based off this chart and nothing else, like good old true PlayStation fan does here, it just shows that you have no clue how PCs actually work. Who honestly cares? How is this newsworthy? Yeah, no, a major first-party Sony game coming to PC, that's not news. System requirements for a AAA game, that's not news. Sony being dishonest about things, that certainly isn't news. Yes, people, yes, it's possible to run it with an HDD and potato graphics, yes, but if you want PS5 graphics or better, you need it. Wait, do you think graphics come from the hard drive?
Lady, have you got your lions crossed?
I remember years ago I made a video about how Sony ponies don't know what SSDs actually do despite bragging about them, and that video got fucking slammed with dislikes, and yet here we are in 2023 and you guys still don't know what SSDs do.
Ironic.
For the record, the hard drive does not have an impact on graphics. You can have an absolutely gorgeous game on an HDD, the same way that you can have a complete potato game on an SSD. The hard drive can determine or contribute to how quickly and efficiently the data is loaded, but when it comes to the actual graphics, the hard drive has next to nothing to do with that. Now, a faster hard drive or SSD can prevent pop-in, sure, but suggesting the HDD locks you to potato graphics, that's just fucking stupid. Where do you even come up with this? The best analogy I can think of right now is if you were baking a cake and you had the option of mixing the ingredients by hand or with an actual mixer. And obviously mixing by hand is going to take longer and probably won't be as efficient as using an actual mixer, but that doesn't mean you won't eventually make the cake anyways. The consoles didn't even have SSDs until a few years ago, so was every game on the console before SSDs were added, did they all look like shit? Did they all have potato graphics? Because I'm pretty sure that's not an argument you would make. The mere fact that this game can run on low settings with an HDD suggests that it can run on higher settings with the HDD, because otherwise this chart makes no fucking sense. I want to fuck Rivet.
God damn it, why do I gotta go to horny jail?
IDK no, bruh. 720p in low settings seems like you need a beefy PC to run max. For $400 you get all that with PS5, so Mark was right. That SSD is required. I'm sure running any game at 720p 30fps with low settings wouldn't require an SSD, but even the chart says recommended. Part 58 of wow, how crazy it is that a chart about PC specs recommends an SSD over an HDD. Just like, everyone on the planet. But also, you agree that the SSD is not required, but then you say, actually, yes, the SSD is required because minimum specs exist. Also, not to be petty, but wasn't Jedi Survivor down at 650p on the PS5? And with its fancy-ass SSD? So complaining about 720p on the PC without an SSD and then being like, ooh, the power, for $400 you get the PS5's dude, come on. Fucking get real. I love that literally from day one, anyone who knew anything about gaming tech was saying that the whole, like, oh, this game could only exist with the PS5's SSD. I love how literally all of us from day one were like, yeah, that's fucking bullshit. And everyone's like, no, it's legit, dude. It's true. Sony has magic penis parts. They can only make games for the magic penis parts. And then the game gets announced for PC. It's like, it's still gonna be SSD required. You know, you better make a PC with the big PS5 penis parts in your PC in order to play Ratchet and Clank with like a big PS5 penis parts. And then the specs come out and they're like, oh, by the way, you didn't need the big penis parts for this. Just sorry, I know it's a little awkward, but yeah, you didn't really need all that. Sorry. And now you guys are looking at that and you're like, well, they said that, but actually what they meant was they still want the big penis parts. Is this breaking down yet? Is this analogy breaking down? I feel like I'm fading very quickly. Fuck, I need coffee. It is too early. Too early. Okay, toodles.